Это наш город. И мы будем каждый раз им об этом напоминать, что мы никогда не смиримся с этой оккупацией.
So summer may be over and cucumber season may be in the past. But with the Russian street restless, local elections looming, and a heavy-handed Kremlin nervous, it promises to be a very hot autumn. So let's talk about it. Hello from CEPA headquarters in Washington, D.C., and welcome to the PowerVertical podcast. My name is Brian Whitmore, director of the Russia program here at CEPA. And joining me here in the studio is Maria Snegovaya, an adjunct fellow here at CEPA and a postdoctoral fellow at Johns Hopkins University. Welcome, Maria, and congratulations on the new gig.
Thank you, Brian.
Good to have you. So, since you just got back from a trip to Russia, a trip that we were all very nervous about here in Washington, and we're all still recovering from the long Labor Day weekend as we are recording early this week on a Tuesday, we'll keep this relaxed and casual today. So you just spent several weeks in Russia, and I wanted to start real broadly with your impressions. I'm curious. We've had weeks of protests in Moscow and other cities. We have local elections coming up this weekend, municipal and regional elections. We have an increasingly aggressive regime that is nervous about its legitimacy as it looks ahead to 2024 when Putin's terms expired. What are your broad impressions after this trip? What jumped out at you? Was anything different? Was anything unexpected?
Certainly, the feel this time around was quite different. I agree. You mentioned that.
You were just there. I think it probably felt different, but I'm curious.
The anxiety is the word I would probably use to describe the situation in Russia. Anxiety on both sides, the opposition and the regime, for sure. I have to mention the weather this summer is unusually cold, the Russian summer, and so perhaps because of that too, the feel was interesting. Certainly, the country is expecting it's the feeling like somebody is expecting for something to happen, and of course, Moscow protests had a huge role to play in it. So we can talk a little bit more about what is unique and different about these protests this time around. First of all, the topic, the agenda. So we are talking about the Moscow Duma elections, an event that historically in Russia would go completely unnoticed because it really doesn't mean much.
But it's the center of the political universe right now.
At this point, and this is fascinating. Now, in fact, a lot of candidates complained when they were collecting signatures in June and July, which is the requirement, again, imposed by the authorities to make it as hard as possible to be able to run for this election. So when they were collecting the signatures, they complained that average Muscovites, do not even know about Moscow Duma's existence,
exactly what the Kremlin wants,
and have no clue what it's doing. But the remarkable thing about these independent candidates, and I think we discussed it some time ago as well, is that despite all these obstacles, a lot of independent candidates have been able to do that precisely to collect about 3% of their districts signatures of the district's residents, which really is a really difficult thing to do. We're talking 4,000 to 6,000 signatures during summer, when people do not reside in their apartments, when they're reluctant to open, and particularly in the center of Moscow, they actually sublease a lot of their apartments, so they don't even live there. And still a lot of candidates were able to do that, but they were not allowed to run. And the Kremlin really hoped that this will be it. Instead, what we saw is completely unprecedented mobilization of the city. And of course, the second largest protests in the last decade after 2011-12. This is completely unprecedented and remarkable.
60,000 estimated, right?
Yeah. And we don't really know quite well how many people they used to be in the streets in 2011. So a lot of people say it's comparable. Unfortunately, it's not growing. So a lot of people were hoping it will be more.
But it's spreading to other cities.
That is absolutely true. And another fascinating and remarkable thing about this protest is not just this huge campaign in Moscow for seemingly minuscule reason. but also the awareness about it across Russia. Actually, as we speak today, a Levada poll was released that specifically asked not the Muscovites but Russians more broadly about the awareness about the protests, and then over 60% of Russians are aware of the Moscow situation. Again, this is really unusual. We are talking Moscow Duma election.
And there are new figures that are kind of emerging now in this situation, younger figures, like Lubov, for example.
Yeah, this is another thing that's cool. A lot of people used to blame Navalny, the all-Russian opposition leader, for being an authoritarian personality, not allowing other leaders to grow. But we see in this particular election that this is not true. A lot of new personalities have emerged who are directly linked to Navalny, but are very independent personalities by themselves, like Lyubov Sobol, as you mentioned, very beautiful, cute blondie. Very charismatic, who proved herself to be very brave.
Clearly very, very smart.
Very smart and very dedicated too. Like, some kind of Jeanne d'Arc of Russia.
That video of her getting arrested went viral.
That and her hunger strike.
Yeah.
Despite having actually a 2-year-old baby. That's a lot of courage.
She's in her early 30s, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah,
so we are now beginning to see this generation actually enter politics. I wanted to touch, because you mentioned, the first thing you said was anxiety, and it reminded me of something Lilia Shevtsova said here in Washington when she spoke at the McCain Institute a few months back, and she said there's two things people are certain about. One is that this can't continue how it is, but the other is that nobody has any idea what comes after it. And this is the way I interpreted this, and we'll get into this more in the second half when we talk about the elections more specifically, but the way I interpreted it was that this fake democracy can't continue, that it's kind of reached its limits, and it either has to evolve into the real thing, which is unacceptable to the Kremlin, or it has to go into all-out repression. This Circovian model of pretending that we're having elections and pretending that we have a parliament in a city, I get the sense that it almost has to go back to a full-on Soviet-style system, or something has to evolve. But the status quo cannot continue. Was that at the heart of the anxiety that you
certainly. I mean, at the heart of the anxiety, I would say a continuous worsening of the living conditions of the Russians, right? It's a sixth year of decline in real disposable incomes. It begins to feel even in Moscow, more so in St. Petersburg, where at some places you literally see buildings starting to, the paint starts to fall out. But of course, it's also complete dissatisfaction with the regime. They feel that there's no way to go, as you said, and at the same time, and the protest is growing in St. Peter, for example. It was remarkable. I spoke to a lot of people, and some of them are not at all, opposition supporters. We always used to argue about these things. Now, I have not met a single person who supports this year's Kremlin candidate for St. Petersburg governor's election, Alexander Beglov, who really proved himself to be quite stupid, frankly, and totally unfit for this job. But in the past, these people always approved of the Kremlin candidate.
Is there a viable opposition candidate, or is it just he's the only one?
The authorities took care of that, so they really eliminated all of the viable.
Who was trying to get in there?
So Bartko, the communist candidate, he is a movie director, quite famous in Russia. He was considered to be the serious opposition to Beglov. Okay. He just announced that he was not going to run a couple of days ago, suggesting that authorities are aware that Beglov, otherwise, the Kremlin candidate, otherwise is not winning in the first round. It's hard to find some good data in St. Petersburg. It's actually a big problem. What the current approval or support for Beglov is. But apparently he's marginally winning in the first round, like it's slightly above or slightly below 50% of votes, and hence the Kremlin had to take care of this and get rid of the communist candidate.
Okay.
Now the big question whether the two remaining candidates, one from Yabloko and then the other one from Just Russia, whether they be able to mobilize enough supporters. In St. Petersburg, it's not very likely. It's actually way less mobilized than Moscow.
This is what I wanted to ask, because you were not just in Moscow. You were obviously you're from St. Petersburg,
Yeah.
so I imagine you visited St. Petersburg. Did you go anyplace else? Did you?
Only to smaller cities like Vyborg, for example.
Okay.
Not
Did
far.
you know? Like, how did you notice a different atmosphere in Petersburg,
Oh, yeah.
Moscow, cities? Well, what did you see there?
So one big deal, one really serious difference, and that's a great question, Brian, that you noticed between Moscow and St. Petersburg, for example. Even if both are considered to be big, capital-like cities, St. Peter always thinks of itself as the second capital, is that in Moscow, most people are mobilized and angry, and they openly speak up against the situation, against Putin directly, like to the extent that it feels almost too brave. So there's so much for dictatorship, as long as you can speak up so openly, we're still not quite there. In St. Petersburg, on the contrary, the feel is more like we are not very happy, but we'd better, keep quiet about that, and they're really scared.
No, if that is unusual, actually, in my experience, St. Pete was often sometimes. I mean, if you go back to the late 80s, early 90s, St. Pete, Leningrad was more
late
angry
80s,
than Moscow.
That's true, but not so much in the 2000s.
Okay.
The Moscow protests always covered disproportionately more protesters than St. Peter did.
What about places like Vyborg and other non-capital cities?
So we've seen a little bit of mobilization. Some of the cities trying to support the Muscovites also hasn't been quite active yet. But the most interesting, but again, remember that we are talking about a thing that's actually a Moscow thing. The very fact that this time around cities actually, proposition across different cities try to support Muscovites is actually a big deal.
Which in and of itself is extremely remarkable, given how the rest of Russia thinks about
Moscow and the general record of Russian opposition that keeps struggling against each other rather than with the Kremlin.
Yeah.
This time around, this is again another thing that was new. Even in Moscow, the unique thing is that this time around, the independent candidates have been able to coordinate and create almost a proto-coalition because they actually backed each other when some of them were not allowed to participate in the election, allegedly unlawfully. So they organized protests to which even those candidates who were registered came. So that's actually unusual. And we actually see this mutual support spreading across the country as well. So in St. Petersburg, this time around, there's municipal election also, along with the gubernatorial election. And
so the legislative assembly is being elected.
The municipal level, not legislative.
So
it's local level. So a lot of people actually were allowed to run, as in Moscow. The lowest level, the Kremlin still allows to participate because these people, municipalities, do not decide anything in Russia. But in St. Peter, despite that, the opposition was relatively successful, able to divide the districts. Again, another relatively new thing because it didn't happen before. They are coordinated and they don't actually oppose each other in most districts. Again, that's new. So one clear takeaway is that the opposition is getting much more professional and organized, as manifested by the very fact that the Moscow candidates have been able to collect the signatures, that they coordinate with each other, and now that they actually come up with different strategies in order to fight Kremlin in this very unfair game.
Did anything surprise you? Or did you see largely what you expected to see?
Well, the mobilization in Moscow on August 10th, the protest that was permitted by the authority was really huge. So, for the reason, relatively, low scale reason like, again, Moscow Duma election, I didn't expect as many people to show up, which was extremely important because at the time the Kremlin was opening all these criminal investigations and trial, and the fact that people were not afraid to show up despite all this backlash is really unusual for Russia, because remember that the 2011 protests started when it was relatively liberal. The regime was still relatively liberal under Medvedev, and there was no backlash. When
and
Ballot,
those initial protests were sanctioned. They were allowed.
They were allowed, and this one was allowed too, but there was no direct direct repressions and backlash. When Ballot happened in 2012, later in May, after Putin came to power, the crackdown on protesters began. There was this Ballot criminal investigation, very brutal. A lot of people were sentenced. Since then, people were really afraid to speak up for quite some time. We actually noticed that in the focus groups, where Russians openly say that the Ballot trial created this fear, which continued until now. It wasn't just a Crimea Effect that stopped the opposition mobilization, but also this fear. And in Moscow, for the first time for years, we saw that the society seems to have overcome. At least these 60,000 people seem to have overcome.
And that's remarkable, because it's not just repression in the sense of cracking heads on the streets. What's happening is, after the fact, suddenly collection agencies are coming to people's houses and trying to repossess property, or you have people trying to take children away from parents. So you're seeing a whole kind of new kind of repression coming into effect after the fact. So you went to the protest, you think everything's okay, and in the next week you get a knock on the door. And is that generating any kind of fear or no?
Certainly, of course. But we see that there's also a lot of irritation that's also created by these crackdowns. We see this in the polls, where a lot of people, even Russians, think that the actions by the authorities were not justified. This is extreme brutality, trying to take away a kid from parents just because they took him with them to the protest. Or, as yesterday, Russia's journalist Ilya Azar was arrested for organizing the protest. He was home alone with his 2-year-old kid. The kid went to sleep. Ilya was in the home alone. The police came, arrested him, took him out of the apartment, didn't lock the apartment. So the kid was...
Left the kid, how old was the kid?
2 years old. Yeah. And everybody, of course, is discussing this. This is outrageous. This backlash of the authorities this time around doesn't only generate fear, but also extreme irritation and hopefully more mobilization in the future.
We've done the qualitative. Let's shift to the quantitative. I'll let you get all scholarly on us, because I know you told me there's some interesting numbers out from the Levada Center, a new poll that had some things. What jumped out at you in this new poll?
So really, as we speak today, this new poll by our favorite Levada Center has been released, where they actually asked Russians across Russia about their attitudes towards the situation in Moscow. And two things jump at you. First of all, as I mentioned, over 60% of Russians are aware of those protests, which is unusual. Half of them say they learned about them through the state TV, unfortunately, but a quarter say through internet and social networks. Again, we're talking Russia. That suggests that the means of information transfer.
Russia-wide. That's not Moscow, Petersburg.
Yeah, they're suggesting that the actual information access is changing in Russia, and this potentially represents a huge challenge to the Kremlin that is no longer holds the monopoly to.
Although they've been trying to control the internet with varying degrees of success for a while.
Various degrees of success, but as we see, Russia always comes up with different ways to overcome
to get
them,
around this,
like Telegram or VPNs and things like that. So, of course, the Kremlin tries to do that, but it's not totally successful by far. And of course, the second most important thing is that the majority of respondents say that the protesters were primarily motivated by the situation in the country. They're unhappy about the situation in the country and unhappiness with the policies of the authorities. Instead of buying of the official narratives about this all being funded from abroad.
Down the street of the State Department.
By the State Department, yes. Exactly. And this is fascinating. So this time around, the Kremlin lost the information control, lost this agenda setting because most of the Russians do not buy the official narratives despite all of the effort. And that certainly is a new.
No, 60% are aware. What percent approve? Is there a number for that?
Approve of what?
Of the demonstrations, like how many view them favorably? Are there any numbers?
About 23% approve. But the majority are neutral or indifferent, 25% are negative.
That's interesting because you basically have an
half
equal amount that care. So you have maybe half the people care about them, and that's split down the middle
Yeah.
in terms of approving and disapproving.
And even more importantly, 41% of respondents believe that the crackdown on the protesters was not justified. This is new. So even if they don't care about it that much, they certainly don't approve of the brutality. In general, not just this poll, but another poll which was released several weeks ago on Moscovites' awareness about the protests show that, as you mentioned, this polarization in the society is becoming more pronounced, with people increasingly divided into those who approve of the authorities and those who do not. And of course, as you could expect, these divides are very closely associated to information sources. So those who approve of the authorities use state TV channels. Those who do not use internet and are generally younger. In the long term, this is certainly a challenge for the Kremlin because, of course, we will see this first group of people who rely on state TV television, slowly disappear, and the Kremlin will be increasingly left with this very angry, very mobilized younger population, which is really, really unhappy about the way things are in the country.
Do you see class stratification in whether or not people are supporting the protest or not? Is this largely a rich kids in Moscow and Petersburg phenomenon, or does it spread to the working class?
At this point, especially given my discussions in St. Petersburg, I think it is actually spreading to the working class. Frankly,
that's deadly for the regime if that happens.
And that is new. Well, of course,
yes,
but that's because, as I mentioned before, the protest is combined from two parts. Part of it is political. This is younger, educated, middle class groups, and the other important part is economic in nature. Right?
This was you anticipated my next question, because I'm kind of putting it into kind of Maslow's hierarchy of human needs here. And is this a kind of a postmodern driven phenomenon by people who want something, who are well off economically and want some kind of higher values, or is it being driven by kitchen table refrigerator issues, to put it in the Russian? You're saying both.
It is certainly both, and the first one, the postmodern one, has been there since 2011.
Yes, and that's when Putin shifted his strategy and went with the lumpen and went and basically put his bet on the working class.
Exactly, but after 5 years income decline, right, you can't really mobilize the working class much either. For example, I have a friend in St. Petersburg whose husband is, this kind of guard in the bank. And he used to be a really big supporter of Putin, also former police officer. Several months ago, he lost a job. Now, she tells me she really hates the Kremlin candidate in the St. Peter election, that she's extremely frustrated with the Kremlin authorities and the officials' authorities, and that she started watching Navalny's video. I have, in the 30 years that I know her, I've never, ever heard her mentioning anything remotely similar. She always hated Navalny. So I think this is an indication. This is St. Petersburg, and of course, in this regions which are poor, that are worse off, you probably observe this dynamic at a larger scale. This is, again, a big threat and challenge to the Kremlin, especially in light of the upcoming regional elections. We are yet to see what the elections will bring. The Kremlin certainly, again, made sure that there is no remotely competitive, viable candidates allowed to run. But as we saw last year, this didn't stop the people from mobilizing and voting out the Kremlin candidates.
Well, and these elections are in 5 days. They'll be, by the time this podcast hits the street, they'll be in a couple of days because they're Sunday. We're recording on Tuesday. We'll probably release on Friday. But I mean, the old stereotype about the battle for the Russian soul, the modern version of the old stereotype, is a battle between the television and the refrigerator, right?
Yeah.
Do you believe the propaganda, or does your stomach tell you the propaganda is nonsense? Is the refrigerator finally winning?
It seems like it became...
So television was kicking the refrigerator's butt for a while.
And of course, thanks to Crimea Effect, right? But of course, the Crimea Effect happened against a relatively good economic situation in Russia. I wonder to what extent the Crimea would have had the same effect had it happened now.
Right.
And certainly we start the fridge effects becoming more pronounced. Like, don't get me wrong, right? One a little bit frustrating thing that we saw again in August is that the amount of protesters in Moscow, at the very least, did not really grow comparing to 2011 again.
Right.
So the frustration is there. The people are so irritated. They fear and no longer works on them.
Right.
So they show up in the streets, but there's still not enough of them. Not enough for them to fundamentally change the situation in the country. But frankly, I do not see possible opportunities for the Kremlin to alternate the situation in the longer term. So we will probably see this dynamic accelerate in the future.
Okay, well, that's a good way to segue into the second half. In a few moments, we'll continue our discussion and take a closer look at these regional and municipal elections slated for September 8th and what they portend. And we'll also take a look at an op-ed by Mikhail Khodorkovsky, which appeared in today's New York Times. I would like to remind you, you're listening to the PowerVertical podcast. My name is Brian Whitmore, director of the Russia program here at CEPA. And joining me here in the studio is Maria Snegovaya, an adjunct fellow here at CEPA and a postdoctoral fellow at Johns Hopkins University. I'd also like to remind you could subscribe to the PowerVertical podcast on iTunes. You could read the PowerVertical blog and watch the vertical video at cepa.org. And you can follow us on the Twitter at PowerVertical. So Mikhail Khodorkovsky had an op-ed in the New York Times this morning being Tuesday, because that's when we're recording, called Putin's Nightmare, the Ballot Box. And to get this segment rolling, Maria, I wanted to just, if you'll bear with me, read a couple passages from it, because I thought it was a pretty interesting op-ed, actually.
Of course.
Khodorkovsky starts as follows. On September 8th, Russians will vote in municipal and regional elections, and the authorities are afraid. Not any foreign power's interference in Russia's elections. There have been no fair elections in decades, but of Russia's own people and opposition candidates who are far more popular than the official nominees. He then goes on to note the regime's bag of tricks. We've seen all this stuff before, moving the elections up to September, giving the opposition little time to prepare, flooding the ballot with fake candidates, introducing online voting, which opens the door in Russia to all sorts of shenanigans. I'm a big fan of online voting, but not in Russia.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Hacking is an art form, and the state is the biggest hacker. And excluding true opposition figures on flimsy pretenses, as you noted. Then Khodorkovsky continues. None of that worked. Thousands of people took to the streets beginning on July 28th to protest the election committee's decisions. In response, the authorities deployed an overwhelming force of local and federal police who detained most opposition leaders and nearly 1,400 demonstrators. And then there's this. The Kremlin has been sending a clear message, Khodorkovsky writes. There will be no Hong Kong here with its huge street protests, and there will be no Istanbul with its fair election that led to the opposition's victory. So I thought that was extremely interesting, the way he set that up. And to achieve this, the Kremlin is determined to use violence on a large scale. It should surprise nobody. This is the natural evolution of an autocracy. When its public slowly turns against the regime, brute force remains its only means to stay in power. But by any measure, the decline of Putinism is inevitable. And this is where I begin to take issue with him, but we can discuss this. Then he goes on to quote Vladislav Surkov as saying, Russia could be maintained only as a military police state, and that Putin was the only leader whom Russian people could trust. Putinism, he maintained, was the new political system, and like Marxism or Leninism, it would last for centuries. And then I'm going to take issue with some of these things. Then comes the chilling conclusion. Most of the recent mass arrests and the brutal treatment of protesters and members of the opposition are a clear indication that the regime is fully prepared to use violence to stay in power. The Kremlin understands that genuine democracy would mean the end of Putinism, and so it leaves those who desire change through democratic means with no options. But does Putin really want to turn Red Square into a Russian Tiananmen Square? Is that where we are, Maria? Your reaction. How did you react? I'm sure you read Mikhail Khodorkovsky's piece this morning. We both saw him speak recently here in Washington. We often agree with him. Sometimes we disagree with him. What was your take on Khodorkovsky? I thought he spelled out the broad contours of this. I'm not sure if Putinism's decline is inevitable.
I think there's a lot of things happening in the op-ed. I certainly agree with the description of the crackdown that Mikhail makes. However, it is true, and I agree with you, that the regime's fortunes are hard to really predict well
they are
at this
ruthlessly
point.
resilient. They've proven themselves to be over and over again to be ruthlessly resilient. But now it's getting to the point, and this is why this stuck with me, this last line, because it may turn into this situation where the only thing that's going to save the regime is a Tiananmen, and that certainly might save them. It might lead to their downfall too.
I have to say that it certainly we understand that like former KGB officers who really struggled to get back the power and finally took it, they are unlikely to give it back peacefully. And a lot of people say that Putin is quite aware of the consequences of Gorbachev's perestroika and also Medvedev's liberalization that, in his opinion, contributed to 2011-12 protests. And hence, he is certainly will, given different options, he's going to go with one that is tightening the screws. The screws. And we kind of saw that beginning in July. But that logic, that reasoning of the authorities, and we have to remember that, it visibly is the function of the number of people in the streets. So the crackdown that began on July 27th against the participants of this protest that was not allowed by the authorities was very brutal, and frankly I was myself quite worried sitting in Russia, when they started talking about eliminating all these people with who work and live abroad and whatnot on this Orange Revolution thread, and that they have to mobilize the security and things like that. However, after on August 10th, 60,000 people showed up in the streets despite all these horrible things happening. The authorities actually scaled down. More so, we saw very unusual personalities, figures, speak out against this crackdown and repressions, such as, for example, former Russia's Minister of Finance Kudrin.
That's
he's a somewhat
that's
predictable, and also somewhat predictable part of Human Rights Council, people who also wrote a letter against this. But what is not predictable is people like Chemezov.
Right.
That was a surprise, wasn't it? Who said in the interview that he thought that repressions were overblown.
What do you think was behind that?
That is a very interesting topic, and apparently that has something to do with the internal elite kind of.
Well, yeah, there's been
calculations.
this struggle between, according to a lot of people, between Sobyanin on one hand and Volodin on the other. But I would have expected Chemezov to be on Volodin's side. That's interesting.
That's why it's so hard to really,
he's a Silovik.
analyze. He's a Silovik. He's the least likely personality to say that, and that is why it was so interesting. And knowledgeable people, so to speak, say that this field was spreading across quite a few elite members who just didn't really speak out about that. And that actually is not the first time it happens. Remember in 2011, when again large protests spread across Moscow, we again saw quite a few members of the elite speak up in support of the protesters. So it's interesting that the Russian system is not your, hardcore dictatorship. It actually is a combination of very closely interconnection of different interests. A lot of those interests at this particular moment in Russian history feel not very happy about the way things are going in the country.
But this suggests to me, and this goes back to Lulia Shevtsova's comments, this goes back to what Khodorkovsky seems to be suggesting in this op-ed. It's the feeling that I've had for some time, is that this status quo is this hybrid system of semi-repressive, semi-dictatorship, fake democracy. You can call it sovereign democracy, managed democracy, or you can call it repression light. You can call it anything. It's not sustainable anymore, and that it can either go one way or the other.
It certainly is, but we also kept, as you mentioned before, kept believing that it was not sustainable for quite some time, right? And
Right.
still, the Kremlin somehow found the way around to navigate around this. Putin is known to be quite a good, this kind of arbiter of the elites, but
it's but more than the elites in the picture now.
certainly,
This isn't
and
just
certainly
elite
the
politics
challenge to
anymore.
the system. It's true, they're certainly considering that, but the chief kind of Kremlin strategist at this point is Sergei Kiriyenko,
Yes.
who used to be considered one of the liberals.
Yeah, I remember
in the
when he
very
was considered a liberal.
distant past. I was still in the high school.
I still had hair.
Yeah, very distant past. But the thing is that he certainly the fear was spread, and the fear was there, especially in July when this brutal attack at the protesters started, as I mentioned. But look at what's happening now. In fact, it was just yesterday that the authorities have terminated the criminal case investigation that they started on July 27th against 4 participants who allegedly implemented the riots, which the riots did
Right.
not happen, but doesn't matter for Russia.
Right, the infamous rioting
This
cases,
this has not happened. Not even after Ballot, this hasn't happened. And another thing is that they have just transferred to house arrest from the jail a couple of very prominent figures, including Yegor Zhukov, who again was arrested on July 27th. He is a young Muscovite and activist, very politically active, has very kind of very open YouTube videos against the authorities, and in fact, every single person has suggested that he was going to stay in jail for quite some time. He was facing a very serious criminal case. A lot of people supported him and backed him. There were open letters, but he just been transferred to house arrest from the jail. That's a good sign. Again, I'm not saying that everything is going to be, puppies and butterflies from now on. I'm just saying that it's not as clear cut. And if you look at the deeper picture, at least for now, it looks like, at least prior to the elections, it looks like the authorities are trying to save face.
But yet, opposition candidates aren't registered. I mean, let's turn to the elections.
Yeah.
Like, what does the opposition hope is going to happen in these elections?
Yeah.
Are there any true opposition figures that can challenge in these elections?
So very few, truly opposition candidates have been registered, especially in Moscow, and those who have been registered, if they're truly opposition candidates and they've been registered, it means nobody knows about them. They're not popular. So every single popular person has not been allowed to run, full stop. And clearly the Kremlin hopes that this is going to be it. But the Navalny's team has come out with this new strategy.
This is what I was,
So-called smart voting.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea is that they will, based on polls and, all kind of indicators, come up with the strongest competitor to the pro-Kremlin candidate,
right,
and mobilize the opposition supporters in the district to back him or her. Very often, this is likely to be, unfortunately, given Russia's realities, a communist candidate,
right.
And there's a lot of, dissatisfaction with this approach among other leaders of opposition, like Mikhail Khodorkovsky, for example. But based on Navalny's estimates, and remember, Navalny's team has its own sociological survey, essentially. I don't know,
his own polling agency.
Agency, so to speak. And they've been able to estimate that if successful, they will be able to push, up to maybe 10, 15, 20. Maybe not as many out of, I think, 145 members of Moscow Duma candidates, but that is going to be a blow to the United Russia.
This is exactly their strategy back in 2011. And
exactly.
we remember the debate between Khodorkovsky and Nemtsov about this.
Yes.
Where Khodorkovsky was saying, let's vote for anybody, vote for LDPR, vote for KPRF, vote for anybody but United Russia. And that it worked that time. I'm wondering if Navalny can go to that well twice and be successful.
In Moscow, they say they might be able to. They cannot do that across all of Russia because in Russia it's just not enough
but all eyes
supporters.
Are gonna be on Moscow.
This time around, it's important that they do. Unfortunately, there's still a lot of struggles within oppositions. Not a lot of people support the strategy. Khodorkovsky offered the moral voting based on you have to vote with your heart and things like that. Unfortunately, it's not going to work in Russia.
Right.
In this system, when you're choosing between the two evils, it's really hard to go with your heart. You have to go with your brains, unfortunately, and pick the lesser evil.
So this puts the KPRF in an interesting position because they're hardly an opposition party. They're a regime party.
They're
systemic opposition. So how are they handling that? That's interesting.
It's interesting, especially in light of St. Petersburg elections, when I mentioned the strongest communist candidate for governor's election just announced his resignation.
Right.
And the Communist Party was very careful about expressing its frustration with the fact that he wasn't going to run anymore, but at the same time not to ask their supporters to come to the election.
Right.
So it's clear that they're trying to play in this game not to piss off the Kremlin, although still being frustrated. But it doesn't matter. This time around,
they have a mobilization capability that nobody else but the regime has.
And that's exactly Navalny's logic. That's why he is calling to back them rather than weaker true opposition candidates that run the district. Just one side note explanation for our audience. Why not vote for any candidates like in 2011, right? Why this time around Navalny says we're going to pick for you the guy who you have to vote for? Because in 2011 the State Duma election was based on proportional basis.
Right.
So any party that wins certain amount of votes above 5% threshold is going to be into the parliament.
So it didn't matter who you voted for, it brought United Russia's total down.
Yeah.
Right.
This time around, it's single-member district, so only the candidate who gets the majority of vote is going to win. So if you do not coordinate around the same candidates, if you vote for different candidates, this is just spreading your vote, and you lose to the United Russia candidate, unfortunately.
Do you think these elections are going to be seen as a watershed when we look back? Are the September 2019 elections going to, if you had to guess now, is this a watershed moment for Russia?
It is certainly a very important moment, I'd say.
It's important, but is it a tipping point moment?
Here I'll be skeptical, honestly. I
would agree with you.
Going with my heart, as Khodorkovsky asked us to do. I would say that my general feel in Russia that the frustration is there. It's like the water that starts to boil. You occasionally see, one bubble pop up, but it's not entirely boiling yet. It's going to take some time. Russia is notoriously, bad in protesting. The Russians have extreme stamina. They're going to wait forever until something horrible happens. So it's going to take them quite some time. But certainly we see that it's new, right? This is something else. And one last point that I forgot to mention, actually, talking about Moscow trip, is that what is also fascinating is the grassroots mobilization that has emerged in Russia. It has started to develop after 2011, and particularly among younger groups, students. This is, again, the first time after early 1900s when we see an independent students movement evolving in Russia. They mobilized, they organized their own, websites, journals, groups. They coordinate, they help people who were arrested. They bring food to jail for these people to the extent that actually people have to post Facebook posts asking not to bring any more food because there's more than enough. And it's actually, there's a lot of volunteering in all different kinds, like looking up for people who get lost and whatnot. We see that actually happening across the country, and the drivers behind it are certainly younger groups. So that's another indicator of this modernization in the Russian society.
So you see a trend, but not yet a tipping point.
Certainly, I would. Frankly, political scientists are very bad in predicting tipping points. I would venture guess it's not there yet. We're going to see this developing for quite some time.
Now, when you made your comment about voting with your heart, I could not help but recall maybe you were too young to remember this, but the 96 election.
We
were both in Petersburg at the time. Remember the Голосуй сердце?
Yeah.
Which was funny, telling people to vote with their hearts.
Yeah.
When Yeltsin had a heart attack in the middle of that election.
It's a great point. Honestly, this In some ways, it's true that the element of morality is really lacking in the system. The Kremlin system has proven itself to be extremely immoral, and a lot of, and to a large extent, this protest, especially in big cities like Moscow, that is not economic in nature but more political, postmodern in nature, is being driven by this demand for morality, for justice, for setting things right. Like take the independent candidates, right? They understand that this 3% barrier of the signatures to get to run for Moscow Duma election is extremely high, unprecedented. There's no political system like that in the world that demands so many signatures of the potential electorate. But the independent candidates, the new generation, they still try to follow the rules. That's their ethos, if you want. They say, all right, that's unfair, but we're still going to do it because we want to show that we play by the rules, and the Kremlin doesn't, and we want to show that we are different. And that's a very important
there's actually a tradition for that. After the Helsinki Accords were signed in 1975, the Soviet dissidents said, we are asking the Soviet authorities to obey their own the agreements they signed onto. Obey your own laws. So there is a little bit of precedent for that.
It's absolutely true.
So as we move to wrap it up, I have one last question for you. As we enter this hot autumn, are you an optimist or a pessimist about the future?
Well, as usual, I always respond to this question in the same way. I'm a short-term pessimist and long-term optimist.
Okay. All right. Okay. We're probably on the same page. So on that note, we will wrap it up. That's all we have time for today. I'd like to remind you, you have been listening to the PowerVertical podcast. My name is Brian Whitmore, director of the Russia program here at CEPA. Joining me here in the studio has been Maria Snegovaya, an adjunct fellow here at CEPA and a postdoctoral fellow at Johns Hopkins University, and she's just back from Russia. Thanks, Maria, for an enlightening and fun discussion.
Thank you very much.
We'd also like to thank our producer, Mikhail Harmata, for keeping the lights on and all the complicated machines working throughout our discussion. And I'd also like to remind you, you could subscribe to the PowerVertical podcast on iTunes. You can read the PowerVertical blog and watch the Vertical video at CEPA.org, and you can follow us on the Twitter at PowerVertical. Join us again next week. And now, as always, I leave you with something other than the ambient sounds of my favorite socially conscious Russian rapper, Noise MC.